In today's Western society, we witness a growing obsession with female lower body parts, along with the sexual objectification of the opposite sex. While some reasons of why this is happening might be blatantly obvious, I thought it would be interesting to dive into the in-depth analysis of this phenomenon in the context of evolutionary psychology and philosophical anthropology. The video will have two parts. In the first section, I will review the major hypotheses that explains this particular sexual preference in the context of evolutionary psychology. The second part is going to be anthropological/philosophical analysis of modern-day obsession with female body parts and its objectification. If you are not interested in evolutionary approach, you can skip right to the second half of the video. Before going into the evolutionary roots of male sexual preference, we need to clarify what is it that exactly constitutes an object of sexual attraction. In the title of this video, I use the word butt. However, the actual target of sexual attraction is more complex than just a big rear end. In reality, a body shape with wide waist and straight hips exhibiting a protruding buttocks won't do the thing. Mostly what men are attracted to is this so-called hourglass shape, which has two major aspects. First, you have low waist to hip ratio, which means that your hips are wider relative to your waist circumference. And second, the curvature of lumbar section of the spine is in the ballpark of 45 degrees. This is where female spine attaches to the buttocks, which is called a vertebral wedging. Now, there was this famous study that showed how men found women with 45-degree wedge to be more attractive, irrespective of the buttock size, which is supposed to clarify that a specific shape is the culprit here, rather than a mere size of a specific body part. Usually, according to the standard narrative, the reason for this type of sexual preference has to do with bearing children. Specifically, women with wider hips are supposed to bear children with more ease, as during a delivery, baby passes through the bony pelvic canal. Considering that the brain of Homo sapiens experienced a dramatic increase in past few million years, the selection for wider pelvic canal seems intuitive. Further, females with 45-degree curvature would have had the advantage in foraging during pregnancy, as such body type would prevent them from spinal injuries. Now, it turns out that this explanation, although being reasonable and fairly logical, is a drop in the ocean. Before going into the evolutionary explanations of this phenomenon, we need to first and foremost define natural selection and sexual selection. Natural selection is a process whereby adaptive traits are preserved and passed onto future generations as they aided an organism in reproduction and survival. The sexual selection is a form of natural selection, where a member of one biological sex will select the opposite sex to mate with, on the basis of specific characteristics such as antlers of the deer, peacock's tail, bright colors in male birds, and so on. Generally, when sexual selection is being explained, scientists stress on the fact of how it can lead to a handicap of an organism, where, for example, peacock's tail would be metabolically expensive and would interfere with the survival of the organism. However, it is still there, this big and this clumsy, just because it is preferred by females. Now, females' low waist to hip ratio and protruded buttocks is a case where natural selection and sexual selection are in harmony, meaning that this adaptation has both reproductive advantage in the sense of male preference and survival advantage in the context of natural selection, as it definitely did not pose a handicap to female locomotion. In the population of Bushmen, the characteristic body shape of a female is called Steatopygia, which describes the protrusion of buttocks and accumulation of fat in the areas of rear end and hips. Firstly, researchers thought that it had something to do with prolonged famine and resource scarcity, where such adaptation would allow women to store food and nutrients. Now, this explanation seems improbable and is mostly rejected, as Bushmen are not strongly selected for desert life. Steatopygia actually evolved because of the sexual selection, as Bushmen males prefer women with larger buttocks. However, a body shape which is characterized with long limbs, short trunk, and accumulation of fat in the back area has a physical advantage in the sense of a heat loss. Body fat generally prevents heat loss and thus keeps the body warm, especially when it is distributed throughout the whole body, which explains why in northern climates, for example, where heat preservation is advantageous, fat is relatively distributed throughout the whole body. The example of Eskimos who have round shape for heat preservation and non-concentrated fat distribution explains the point. Now, in African ecology, heat loss would be preferable for obvious reasons. Thus, body fat accumulation in one body area coupled with sexual selection would clearly be adaptive. Now that the physical advantage is covered, let's get to the hypotheses from evolutionary psychology. First, Q of biological sex. The fact that waist-to-hip ratio is higher in men than women is an example of sexual dimorphism, the latter being a difference between individuals of different sex in the same species. Considering that this anthropological factor is transcultural, as there is no known society where men's WHR is either higher or equal to women's, points to its selective history. For sexual reproductions, males have to identify their opposite sex. Therefore, waist-to-hip ratio can work as a cue of biological sex. The very fact that decrease in waist-to-hip ratio takes place when puberty ensues further supports this hypothesis, as it indicates that a female is entering into her fertile years. Beginning of the menstrual cycle and the deposition of fat in gluteofemoral area happens at the same time as they are both controlled by androgenic activity. Therefore, lower WHR, apart from being a reliable indicator of biological sex, also works as a cue of biological age of fertility. This is generally congruent with the pattern whereby most morphological indicators of opposite sex are simultaneously sexually attractive, such as female hair, voice, breast, long nails, facial features, and so on. Some men even get fixated on female gullet and ankle, as they are also sexually dimorphic. Now, this hypothesis seems reasonable, as from a biological perspective, the detection of opposite sex happens on the basis of secondary sexual characteristics. That's why animals tend to attempt copulation with artificially made objects that mimic the secondary sexual characteristics of their opposite sex. For example, male turkey will famously attempt to mate with a head on a stick. More noteworthy example is male jewel beetles, mating with beer bottles in Australia. Also, we have to consider that female waist-to-hip ratio decreases in the period of ovulation, a period when mature egg is released from the ovary, being ready for fertilization. On the flip side, during ovulation, females find men with more pronounced jawlines to be more attractive, which shows how sexually dimorphic features are accentuated in the context of sexual attraction. Second, cue of quantity and availability of reproductive fat. Fat accumulated in gluteofemoral area represents a specific form of fat, namely long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, which play a huge role in neural development of an embryo. That is one of the reasons why fat deposition in those areas begin when estradiol concentration rises during female puberty. Also, it explains why the fat in this area is last to go away when females lose weight, as it is metabolically protected so that it can be recruited during pregnancy. On the other hand, abdominal fat limits the enzyme sigma-5 desaturase, which is necessary for the synthesis of long-chain fatty acids. Therefore, lower waist-to-hip ratio should be an indicator for man that his offspring is going to be healthier. There is a study showing that children of women with lower waist-to-hip ratio score higher on cognitive tests. Further, the more children a woman has, the more her waist-to-hip ratio increases, which is thought to be one of the reasons of why IQ is negatively correlated with birth order. Third, Q of center of body mass. This hypothesis claims that when it comes to pregnancy, waist-to-hip ratio affects body's center of mass in a positive way. Obviously, as Homo sapiens became bipedal, the stress and load on lower back increased, and foraging for women while being pregnant became a lot harder. Now, the fact that embryo develops in the interior portion of the female body, directly above the center of gravity, predisposed our ancestors to falling down on their fetuses, thus increasing the chance of a genetic loss. Low waist-to-hip ratio is supposed to balance out this anterior load, as it lowers the center of mass, thus increasing bipedal stability. This is achieved by depositing fat in the buttocks and thighs, which prevents center of gravity from moving upwards and forward, which would increase the anterior load. Therefore, choosing a mate with lower WHR would increase the survival of the fetus. Now, this hypothesis probably has something to do with the major reason of why Homo sapiens evolved specifically this shape of butt. Generally, none of our primate relatives have the same morphology of buttocks. Evolutionary biologists claim that it evolved as a consequence of walking upright. The primary determining factor of the way our butts look like is the structure of the pelvic bone, especially the ilium. In the last 6 to 8 million years, when our line diverged from the last common ancestor with chimpanzees, the pelvic bone had undergone major changes and reorganizations, thus being a subject of natural selection. Therefore, it should not be a surprise that generally men would select women on the basis of pelvic bone structure. So, for example, the ilium of chimpanzees are relatively tall and flat, where those flat parts face forwards and backwards. Our ilium, on the other hand, is shorter and curved around more to the sides, which makes our pelvis look like a bowl. This skeletal evolution is directly linked with the reorganization of our gluteal muscles that makes upright walking possible, being the target of exercise, especially in females. So, considering that pregnancy still creates difficulties in walking, it seems intuitive that lower waist-to-hip ratio, which involves a wider pelvic bone, would make walking and foraging much easier. Fourth, cue of current pregnancy. Now, in order for a male to select a woman for the purpose of potential mating, he has to be sure that the opposite sex is not pregnant. This carries the risk of investing in someone else's offspring. Higher waist-to-hip ratio could be an indication of current pregnancy, as it definitely increases during embryonic development. Therefore, lower waist-to-hip ratio should be a relatively safe indicator that a certain female is not pregnant, but rather is ready to get pregnant, thus being a good candidate for potential mating. Also, studies show that men perceive women with lower waist-to-hip ratio less likely to be pregnant. Fifth, cue of parity. Parity in this case means the number of children previously born. As waist-to-hip ratio increases along with the number of born children, it could indicate to a male that he won't be able to sire as much children as he otherwise could. The experiments regarding perception of waist-to-hip ratio show that males expect females with high waist-to-hip ratio to have more children. Therefore, it could be a reliable indicator of whether female is pregnant or not. Sixth, cue of ability to cope with stress. According to this hypothesis, lower waist-to-hip ratio should indicate that a female is able to handle stressful situations, whereas high waist-to-hip ratio would indicate the opposite. Now, this can be paralleled with how abdominal fat increases during the chronic stress, also known as inner fat. Now, women who have higher waist-to-hip ratio report chronic stress and have more psychological and psychiatric issues. One experiment showed that women with higher WHR did worse in laboratory challenges that measured the stress coping abilities. Also, they reported to have experienced more chronic stress than controls. Henceforth, it is probable that women with lower waist-to-hip ratio were perceived as more capable of surviving in stressful environments. Furthermore, we have to consider that chronic stress is extremely detrimental to fetus's health, as studies show that the birth weight is negatively correlated with stress level of the mother. Cue of sexy daughters. Studies show that women with lower waist-to-hip ratio are more likely to bear daughters who would also develop low waist-to-hip ratio, thus making it a heritable trait. This would make them more preferable mates, as in the sexy daughter's case, the chances of genetic material being propagated would definitely increase. Now, this type of selection is in essence indirect, as males don't choose their mates based on this type of called long-term calculation. Rather, if sexy daughter advantage actually plays a role here, then it evolved as a form of indirect advantage. Now, although this might sound improbable, we have to consider its congruence with the gene-centered view of evolution, where ultimately genes program their vehicles so that it could maximize the copying of existing genetic material. Now, of course, I understand the danger of anthropomorphizing of genes. However, this type of indirect advantages do evolve as a product of natural selection. Now that I have covered all the major hypotheses regarding sexual selection of female hourglass shape, I want to get to the topic of modern-day artificial augmentation of those specific areas by technological means. This process of pronouncing already sexually attractive body parts extends from simply wearing high heels, which specifically tilts pelvis so that it looks more wider, to plastic surgery and Photoshop. Now, the purpose of me touching this subject doesn't aim at making already evident and obvious connection between evolutionary programmed sexual preference and its explanatory power in the context of plastic surgery. Rather, I want to briefly address this view that I have encountered, namely that it is unnatural and socially constructed that males are sexually attracted to such body shapes, as most of the time they're a product of surgery and thus not real. Well, not real is not and has never been an issue for sexual preference. In this context, I would prefer Baudrillard's term, the hyperreal, rather than unreal, to describe the situation. Now, you don't think that it would be any different in Animal Kingdom. Here's an interesting experiment with respect to sexual selection of augmented traits. There is a species called long-tailed widow birds, where as usual male birds have these inadequately long tails that are of course a handicap and metabolically expensive, but they are still there because female birds select males based on the length of their tails. Now, scientists made an experiment where they divided male widow birds in 3 groups. In the first one they shortened the tail, in the second they left it the way it was, and in the third they artificially lengthened it. Well, you guessed it, females preferred males with prolonged tails that they would otherwise never encounter, as it was obviously unnatural. So I don't think that it is a surprise that fake breast and Brazilian butt lift, although it even being noticeable, would cause males to rethink their initial sexual attraction. Now that the science part is covered, I want to discuss modern-day obsession with female body parts and how women are objectified and reduced to their sexual value. Now, when I say reduced, I don't mean that men or some specific group is responsible for it. Rather, I will try to present an integral, multivariable account of the situation. For introduction, I want to start with Camille Paglia, a cultural critic and author influenced by Jungian thought and anthropology. In her book, The Sexual Personae, she talks about the evolution of how females are perceived from the period of hunter-gatherers to modern Western civilization. She analyzes the famous Venus figurines that existed in Upper Paleolithic period. Now, the most popular being the Venus of Willendorf, understood as a symbol of fertility. She has enlarged areas which are directly connected with the phenomenon of pregnancy, such as thighs, hips, buttocks, breasts, and abdominal area. Now, of course, this figurine doesn't represent a subject of sexual preference, as she looks like someone who is pregnant. The purpose that this figurine carries is to make it clear that she's a female, as she has all the body parts that are specifically enlarged to function as a cue of sex determination. Now, surely this doesn't in any way suggest that modern hourglass aesthetical standard is artificial, as there are other Venus figurines that very much repeat this shape of slim waist and wide hips. Here's one from Indus Valley territory. Now, this one is found in Russia and has the same overall shape. So not all of them replicate the Willendorf shape of the enlarged belly area. However, for Paglia, the interesting aspect is the lack of face in these figurines. The explanation is that they lack individuality and a personae, an inner self which is symbolized by unique nature of facial structure. In this context, the ego and the individuality has not yet emerged, and therefore female is primarily understood as a symbol of fertility. Now, when civilizations come in, such as ancient Egypt, according to Paglia, we get a sense of individuality, which is symbolized by replacing pure body with pure face. She gives the example of bust of Nefertiti, with open eyes and accentuated facial features, lacking bodily components. Now, Paglia understands this as a shift from unconscious period of Great Mother archetype to a civilization, where ego emerges out of the unconscious and you get an individual with a personality. However, our modern understanding of individual with its inner realm and psyche is still not there. In the Western Renaissance, we get to a real three-dimensional female with live facial expression who represents neither royalty nor any divine power. Now we have a pure individual who, unlike Nefertiti with static facial expression, is alive and dynamic. Now, if you think about it, Renaissance portraits look like as if they are gifs, waiting to be clicked on so that the person in the canvas comes to life. On the one hand, we have a conventional high culture individual, which is perceived as a whole, with evident personhood. And on the other hand, we have a pre-civilizational figurine, where femaleness equals fertility and her individuality is non-existent. For Paglia, Hollywood and modern cinema, along with electronic media, is an example of what she understands to be a resurrection or eruption of pagan spirit. One of the key differences between Abrahamic religions and pagan ones is that the first is based on logos, the word, where imagistic thinking is suppressed and representation of divinities in art is considered to be an idolatry. On the other hand, paganism is all about visual representation. Paglia notes that the whole essence of Western cinema is that you can watch a film without listening to it at all, but still understand the crux of it, as the story is primarily told by means of images. Now, in this case, objectification of women and reduction of their value to sexuality could be understood as a side effect of pagan revival, which is supported by Neo-juangian understanding of idolatry and female objectification. The primary reason why Judeo-Christian religion rejected idolatry, according to Jungian psychology, is the shift from a part to a whole, from a fragment to unity, and from finite to infinite. The major ontological difference between pagan idols and biblical God is the feature of locality. Namely, pagan gods have local power with local competencies and individual storylines, whereas biblical God is ever-present, way less anthropomorphized than pagan gods, and undergoes an evolution from a god who expresses emotions and takes sides in wars to a hyper-abstract concept of logos. Therefore, an objectification and reduction of the opposite sex to a body part is primarily reminiscent of a condition where tangible fragment is more valuable than an abstract concept that stands for something. The addicted lover unconsciously invests the finite fragments of his experience with the power of the unity, which he can never experience. This shows up again in the interesting phenomenon of pornography collections. Men under the fragmenting energy of the addict will often amass huge collection of photographs of nude women and then arrange them in categories like breast, legs, and so on. Then they will lay the breasts out side by side and delight in comparing them. And they will do the same with legs and other bits and pieces of the female anatomy. They marvel at the beauty of the parts, but they can't experience a woman as a whole being, physically or psychologically, and certainly not as a unity of body and soul, a complete person with whom they could have an intimate human relationship. Imagine how normalized it is that a male can simply derive sexual satisfaction from gazing at a fragment of his opposite sex, while you would naturally find it odd if female had a picture of a male shoulder, for example, in her room, serving a function of a sexual gratification. Now, when I started to think about the content of this video, the first thing that came to my mind was Iain McGilchrist's Master and his Emissary, which is one of my favorite works in this genre. Here, he tries to give an account of West's cultural history in the light of hemispheric specialization. The first part of the book is dedicated to presenting the differences between how each hemisphere perceives and brings world into being. The second part is about analysis of how the left hemisphere, which is in essence the emissary of the right master hemisphere, gradually came to be autonomous. Now, the basic differences relevant to this video between hemispheres is as follows. The right hemisphere is responsible for global attention, recognition of the whole as a gestalt, an emergent property which cannot be reduced to its constituent parts, perceiving living things, openness to new experience, intuition, and empathy. On the other hand, left hemisphere's attentional mode is local and concrete. It perceives world as composed by individual building blocks. It understands world methodologically and analytically and is blind to the whole. For example, if right hemisphere is presented with this picture, it would instantly recognize an H and a 4, whereas all left hemisphere can see is the mass of E's and 8's. According to McGilchrist, we live in a left hemisphere dominant world, where functions of the right hemisphere became irrelevant. Therefore, the domination of left hemisphere results in the world of technocracy, excessive digitalization, division and hyperspecialization of disciplines, atomization and pathological individualization of society, and destruction of grand meta-narratives that try to understand the world as a whole, rather than perceiving it as a disorganized mass of fragments. Now, regarding the right hemisphere function, it is worth touching the famous book from Oliver Sacks, titled The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. In the first clinical tale, he presents a case of a man diagnosed with Prosopagnosia, which is a condition where a patient is unable to recognize the whole, a gestalt. This person could not recognize faces of people and also couldn't recognize objects instantly. For example, when doctor gave him a rose, he did not know what he was holding there. but eventually by inductive reasoning, recognizing its parts such as thorns, stems and petals, he got to an aha moment, guessing that it was a rose. From this, we could reasonably describe modern society as suffering from a metaphorical prosopagnosia, where everything acquires its value by proximate and fragmentary utility. A society where part and a fragment is hypertrophied and enlarged to the point where it dwarfs the whole, making it insignificant. This is reminiscent of a passage from Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In the chapter called Redemption, we read, "And as I came out of my solitude and crossed over the bridge the first time, then I didn't believe my eyes, and I looked again, and said at last, that is an ear as big as a person. And I looked more closely, and really, beneath the ear something was moving, that was pitifully small and pathetic and thin. And in truth, the gigantic ear sat upon a little slender stalk, but the stalk was a human being. If one used a magnifying glass, one could even recognize a tiny, envious miniature face, even a bloated little soul dangling on the stalk." This is a concept that Nietzsche refers to as an inverse cripple, where rather than lacking an organ, one exhibits an overdevelopment of it. Nietzsche points to the modern-day obsession with hyper-focused and specialized geniuses who have one-dimensional talents. However, this concept very much extends to our topic, where someone's sexually pronounced body parts can dwarf the whole individual, making it valueless. Moreover, the left hemisphere domination shows itself not only in reducing whole to its part, but rather in the act of dehumanization of the opposite sex. One of the major differences between left and right hemisphere is that the latter perceives living things with its dynamism and inner essence, whereas left hemisphere perceives dead static objects with no entrails. The humanization of the opposite sex is all over the place. Examples of seeing women as animals in sexual entertainment, referring to them as a cat lady, chick, using a B word which means a female dog, a bimbo, someone whose value comes from only external appearance, and others. The plastic surgery which ossifies facial expression into a static mask further exacerbates the situation. The Botox basically freezes female expression into a two-dimensional symbol with no liveliness and dynamism, excluding all the intricate details of facial structure that account for someone's unique individuality. This further shows the left hemisphere dominance. People who had colossotomy, a surgery where corpus callosum, a fibrous structure which connects two hemispheres, is surgically removed, experience a split in how they perceive and attend to the world. So if left hemisphere is asked to draw the picture, they're usually static, still and symbolic, whereas right hemisphere drawings are more lively and dynamic. Now interestingly, there is an experimental evidence to back the claim of McGilchrist about left hemisphere dominance. Study done by Sarah Jarvis in 2012 explores what's known as sexual body part recognition bias hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, female sexual body parts are recognized better when presented in isolation than when presented in the context of entire bodies. The two experiments conducted showed that both males and females perceive female bodies with local attention rather than global attention, reducing the whole body to the sexual part. Also, the experiment demonstrated that the female body parts are actually better recognized in isolation rather than in the context of the whole body. On the flip side, male body parts were better recognized when presented as a whole rather than in isolation. Now, the very fact that female body parts can be decontextualized that easy reminds us of the Martin Heidegger's concept of deworlding, which is an intellectual feature, or more appropriately a bug, of modern intellectual world. Deworlding is the process whereby an object of investigation is ripped from its worldliness and nexus of being so that it can be analyzed and deconstructed. Now, this left hemisphere approach is useful in sciences which deal with dead objects, such as physics and chemistry. However, their applicability in humanitarian realm is not just unreasonable, but pernicious to say the least. Now, unfortunately, as we can see, we start to treat people with this cold approach, as if we desire to have a model of a real car without inner parts. That's the prevalence of what's known as a trophy wife. Now, the current situation with dehumanization and sexual objectification cannot go on without major consequences. Females who are objectified report more chronic stress and social anxiety, whereas males blunt their ability to engage in emotionally rich relationships. Now, the whole process of cultural decadence, along with losing the sense of the whole, involves every aspect of living. In this video, I reviewed one such manifestation. However, I will make other videos regarding this theme, analyzing similar social tendencies regarding aforementioned issue of shifting from a high culture to a dead civilization. Now, as always, I want to thank my Patreons for supporting the channel and fueling me with motivation and means to continue creating videos. If you decide to become a Patreon, you can find the link in the description. Specific tiers are granted with scripts and behind-the-scenes work. Also, I'm working on a Discord channel which for now is only available for Patreons, but I will soon make it public. Patreons will have special roles on my Discord channel. Also, I created other social accounts and you can find the links in the description. Thank you again and stay tuned.